We're going to start this lesson. And last week in John 3.
We're in John?
Yes. The Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's in the New Testament. And what we went over in chapter 3, the first part, was the story of Nicodemus and Jesus. And Nicodemus was a Pharisee and came to Jesus by night. And then Jesus basically laid out the whole gospel story to him in detail. And we discovered later that he actually did become a disciple of Christ. But it took a while. So now we're at verse 22. And I'm going to read verse 22 through 36. This is John the Baptist talking. And it's like his swan song as far as telling about Jesus. And the swan song is like your last thing that you do before you're going to die. And he does end up dying. This is the last testimony that he has about Christ. Okay, after these things, that means after this whole incident with Nicodemus, Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he tarried with them and baptized. Now we're going to find out in chapter 4, verse 2, that it wasn't actually Jesus, but his disciples that were baptizing. And he was authorizing it, though. And then verse 23, and John was also baptizing in Aenon, near to Salim, because there was much water there. And they came and were baptized, for John was not yet cast into prison. He eventually gets thrown into prison and gets executed, gets his head cut off. And then there arose a question between some of the disciples of John and the Jews about purifying. And they came unto John and said unto him, Rabbi, he that was with thee beyond Jordan, now they're speaking about Christ, to whom thou bearest witness, behold, the same is baptizing, and all men come to him. Sounds like there's a little jealousy going on here. And John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. Ye yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but that I am sent before him. I'm going to stop right there and just explain a little bit of what's going on here. So when Jesus' disciples started baptizing, they weren't that close, but they were kind of in the same proximity, okay? So basically everyone was coming to Jesus at this point. And so I kind of wonder why John still had disciples. When he pointed out Jesus, why didn't they all follow Jesus? But only two of them did. That was Andrew and John. So I kind of wonder about that. What he's saying in verse 27, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from heaven. What he's saying is that everything that a man does that is sacred, like a sacred ministry, it only comes from heaven. And if it doesn't come from heaven, it's not a sacred ministry. Okay? There's lots of them around. In verse 29, he says, he that hath the bride is a bridegroom. Who's the bride?
The church.
The church. And who's the bridegroom?
Jesus.
Okay. This is what he's talking about. He that hath the bride is a bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which stands and heareth him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. I want to read you just a little snippet on that verse from J. Vernon McGee. And this is what he said. One cannot escape the tremendous force of this friend. John the Baptist is the last of the Old Testament prophets. He's actually not in the church. Remember, he said he was the friend of the bridegroom, and he wasn't the bride. So he's not in the church. He is actually not in the church. He makes it clear. He that hath the bride is a bridegroom. Then who's John? He is a friend of the bridegroom. He will be present at the marriage of the supper of the Lamb, but he is not part of the church by any means. He is the last of the Old Testament prophets who walks out of the Old Testament onto the pages of the New Testament to announce the coming of the Messiah. John was not part of the church because he was before that was to be established. And that this verse right here tells you. In verse 31, he cometh, he's still speaking of Christ. He that cometh from above is above all. He that is of the earth is earthly, and speaketh of the earth. He that cometh from heaven is above all. So he's talking the difference between him and Christ, and keep making the comparison. And what he has seen and heard, that he testifies, and no man receives his testimony. Because pretty much everybody rejected Christ. Not everybody, like he's got this following here. But the majority rejected him, especially his own people, the Jews. He that has received his testimony has set to his seal that God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God. For God giveth not the Spirit by measure unto him. Remember when I was talking about Jesus being a prophet, and I said this very thing, that he was always speaking the words of God, and that's what made him a prophet. A prophet speaks to God and then tells you what God said, whereas a priest takes your sacrifices and offers them to God. It's just the opposite. One goes from God to the people, and one goes from the people to God. For the Father loves the Son, and has given all things into his hand. He that believeth on the Son has everlasting life, and he that believeth not shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. And what we learned from the end of John 3 was it says the wrath of God abideth on him because he's condemned already. The whole world is already condemned. If they don't do anything to change that situation, they're going to stay that way. So that's what he says. Unless they listen to his testimony and accept it, the wrath of God is going to be on them.